So for learning objective 2, we want to discuss Lincoln's original motive to preserve the Union, and why he felt it so important to do so for fighting the Civil War, and why he changed his motive to pursue the war for emancipation of the slaves. So his initial reason for wanting to go to war with the South, because there were people in the North saying, let the South go, but he felt the stakes were too high. It was absolutely to preserve the Union. And so here's in an open letter to Horace Greeley in the New York paper, Lincoln made the following statement: "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, preserving the Union, and shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when I am shown to be an error, and I shall adopt new views so fast that they shall appear to be true views." So again, his paramount concern is to preserve the Union at all costs. And let me just bring up this interview between a historian, Bruce Levine, and talk show host Terry Gross from Fresh Air, that talks about why that was actually important. Why was it important to preserve the Union? Why was he willing to go into such a horrendous war and to continue fighting such a horrendous war to preserve the Union? So let's just take a listen to this clip from the interview. It's about 2 minutes.
So I'm going to ask a really stupid question that probably anybody who ever took an American history course, as I have, should not need to ask. But tell me more about why it was so important to the North to maintain the Union. If the South was doing something that the North was so horrified at, the institution of slavery, and the South wanted to pull away, but there's still a lot of racism in the North, why did the North care so much about having the Southern states within the Union?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate the extent to which people know the answer to this question. And I don't think it's a bad question at all, therefore.
I'm so relieved to hear you say that.
We have to remember that the mid-19th century is a time when in the transatlantic world, the norm is not Republican, small r, government, that is, living in a republic. The norm is still monarchies and aristocracies and societies in which non-aristocrats have relatively few rights and particularly little control over their government. So this is still a very unusual place. Despite the existence of this horrible, oppressive system of slavery, for white people, this is a remarkable outpost of freedom. And of course, especially for white men, since white women have considerably fewer rights than men. But for white men, then, this is the cutting edge of progress. They believe that what protects the rights that they have is the strength and unity of the country. And they fear that as sections of the country begin to withdraw from the Union, the country will continue to fragment, that this will only be the beginning of the fracturing of the Union. And by the way, there's some reason to think in retrospect that they were right. There are, for example, individuals, including the mayor in New York City, who begin to talk actively about pulling New York out of the Union, because New York in that era has powerful economic ties to the slave South, and making it a so-called free city on the model of such things in Europe. Sections of the lower Midwest display sympathy for the South. Sections of Midwestern states heavily populated by white migrants out of the South. And so instead of there being one powerful, more or less powerful country in North America, south of Canada, that is, and north of Mexico, there might be two and maybe three and maybe four, and so on. And that in turn might very well lead to the end of Republican government in North America. And again, we're talking about an era in which much of the world still thinks that Republican, non-monarchical, non-aristocratic government is doomed. And that had been the opinion in Europe for many, many centuries, based on looking at what had happened to ancient Greece and ancient Rome and various city-states thereafter. So the idea that republics are stable is not very widespread. And indeed, large numbers of forces in monarchical Europe are rubbing their hands in positive anticipation of seeing this dangerous, provocative idea, large republic sustaining itself, finally crumbling.
So, but how much of preserving the Union, as far as the North was concerned, was economic, because it needed access to the South's cotton?
Well, that's a factor. Textile manufacturers in New England want that cotton and want easy access to cotton. Furthermore, farmers in the Midwest want easy and continuous access to the Mississippi River in order to sell things to Southerners and to export through the port of New Orleans. But I think it's too easy to exaggerate the degree to which economic motives are driving the North. I think more powerful a motive is the desire to preserve the Union in order to preserve Republican liberty.
So we have President Lincoln understanding quite strongly that if the South is able to secede and this goes unchecked, it's going to set precedent, and the United States will break up into several republics. And because of the rich resources of the United States and in the country itself, with its timber, its oil, its rich farmland, this would become a contest amongst these different nation states, potential nation states, which would inevitably lead to warfare. And Lincoln understands, as the Civil War is going to produce, anytime you have warfare, there are restrictions on civil liberties. It's inevitable. Sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's direct. So it's Lincoln himself suspends habeas corpus. That is basically the legal concept that if you are detained by authorities, they have to tell you why you are being arrested and give you an opportunity to defend yourself. For a lot of his critics during a course of the war, he suspended them and rounded up critics and threw them in jail, right? And so this is going to, what he believes is going to happen is that if we allow the South to secede, this is going to become basically the norm, and therefore the very idea of democratic republicanism, that is having governments that represent the will of the people, will become a historic event. So this quote right here it basically sums up his views on why it is so important to preserve the Union. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people, by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, few in number, can arbitrarily break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government upon the face of the earth. So Lincoln understood the necessity of enabling his countrymen to believe they were embarked on an ennobling crusade, and he plainly came to believe it himself. Right? This much was at stake, he believed. While Lincoln was defining the war as democracy's struggle for survival, other people around him wanted different and more radical definitions for them. Slavery was the paramount issue. So Lincoln knew slavery was the root of the rebellion and was personally opposed to slavery. So, in fact, Lincoln also tried to take the slavery question out of the realm of the moral and legal dispute by dramatizing it in terms of free labor's self-interest at the national level. Right, he basically tried to couch the problems with slavery in practical terms rather than moral terms, that if we have slavery spread throughout the country, it will devalue the worth of free labor. It'll devalue wages, in other words. So that was always his political, rhetorical take on slavery prior to the Civil War and in the first few years of the Civil War. So he thus gave it a universal appeal, meaning to white people who were the wage laborers in the North. So this was done by stating that he opposed slavery's further extension because it was for the benefit of all Northern white men for slavery to be absent in the territories. Lincoln claimed slavery might become a national if it allowed to expand, and thus created a challenge to the economic freedom of the common white person. This concept is reflected in the following quote. So the whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these territories. We want them for homes of free white people. This they cannot be, to any considerable extent, if slavery shall be planted within them. Slave states are places for poor white people to remove from, not to remove to. The new free states are the places for poor people to go to and better their condition. For this use, the nation needs these territories. So he shared the view of most Northern white voters that black people were racially inferior to whites. Even if he considered fighting the war against slavery, he could not conceive of it as a war for black equality. He was deeply convinced that the Constitution did not give him the power to interfere with slavery within the states. So this was his view before the Civil War, and even through the first couple of years of the Civil War. But as the war progressed, Lincoln pondered the slavery question and its legal and ethical implications. And out of this pondering, he developed what could be seen as a permanent solution to the problem of slavery. Lincoln's plan called for, quote, compensated emancipation, and can be summarized as follows. One, the states themselves must emancipate the slaves, for in his opinion, slavery was a domestic institution. Number two, slave owners must be paid for the chattels of which they would be deprived, so they would be compensated by the federal government, presumably. Three, the federal government must share the financial burden by providing federal bonds as grants and aids to the states. Four, the actual freeing of the slaves must not be hurried. The states must be given plenty of time, delaying final freedom as late as perhaps the 1900s, if they wish. So theoretically, Lincoln at first believes that slavery might continue within the 20th century. And five, finally, the freed blacks must be shipped out of the country and colonized abroad. But they must be persuaded to go willingly, because he believed that racial animosity would be so persistent and so ingrained in American society that there would be no ability for coexistence. So basically, federal aid, gradual emancipation, and voluntary colonization were the indispensable features of Lincoln's personal plan. However, Congress and political events would not allow this plan to materialize. And this is what we'll look at in the next learning objective.